right, everyone's in. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 173rd New Social Environment. I'm Malva Kajali and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between artists and luminaries Jeffrey Gibson, Paul Ramírez Jonas, and Xaviera Simmons in dialogue with curator Jess Wilcox on Monuments Now, a phenomenal public art exhibition which opened at Socrates Sculpture Park earlier this year. We'll also be joined by poet, organizer, educator, and DJ Jive Poetic, who will read a few verses to close today's program. To begin, I'd like to ask you to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of the unceded land and waters on which we stand. The Brooklyn Rail also recognizes the illegal annexation of the Republic of Artsakh as a grave injustice internationally. We stand in support of the Armenian people and their rich global diaspora. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprisings that have been unfolding earlier this year and in my book continue in response to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., and countless others who we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country. I'd also like to acknowledge institutionally that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. Before I introduce our illustrious guests, we invite you to join us for a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce our illustrious panel, Jeffrey Gibson's multimedia practice, hey, synthesizes the cultural and artistic traditions of his Cherokee and Choctaw heritage with the visual languages of modernism and themes from contemporary popular and queer culture. Got everything in there. His work is a vibrant call for queer and Indigenous empowerment, envisioning a celebration of strength and joy within these communities. He is a citizen of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, is currently an artist in residence at Bard College, and lives and works near Hudson, New York. Give it up. Can't clap, but we would. I'll clap. Paul Ramírez Jonas currently lives and works in Brooklyn. Over the last 25 years, he has created works that range from large-scale public installations and monumental sculptures to intimate drawings, performances, and videos. Through his practice, he seeks to challenge definitions of art and the public, engineering participation and exchange. He's currently an associate professor at Hunter College. And finally, let me find you. Zafiria Simmons' remarkable body of work spans photography, performance, video, sound, sculpture, installation, and so much more. She defines her studio practice, which is rooted in an ongoing investigation of experience, memory, abstraction, present and future histories, and specifically shifting notions surrounding landscape. She defines this all as cyclical rather than linear, which is something I think we all should get behind. In other words, Simmons is committed equally to the examination of different artistic modes and processes. For example, she may dedicate part of a year to photography, another part to performance, another part to installation, video, and sound works, keeping her practice in constant and consistent rotation, shift, and engagement. I love that, and I feel like that will be evidenced in the work we share today. And last but not least, the fabulous Jess Wilcox is the curator and director of exhibitions at Socrates Sculpture Park, where she's curated several group and solo exhibitions, including Chronos Cosmos, Deep Time, Open Space, Virginia Overton Built, and a variety of other ones, also including the Socrates annual exhibitions. From 2011 to 2015, she worked at the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum, one of my favorite places. And there she organized public programs and public artworks, including Agitprop, an exhibition of historical and contemporary political art. And today we are so lucky to have her captaining this curatorial ship. So without further ado, Jess, passing the mic over to you. And if you press the unmute button at the, perfect.
Perfect, now I'm unmuted. Thank you so much, Malvika, and thank you to the Brooklyn Rail for this platform and invitation. It's really an honor to be with such great voices. So I'm just going to begin for those of you who haven't had a chance to stop by the exhibition to just give a little background on how I came up with the idea, I guess, and what we were thinking about at Socrates, and how the invitations to these three fabulous artists came about before we go into their specific projects, and then after a conversation about, the resonances between them and monuments more in general. So I guess I would say, one of the reasons I put together this show is I'd been working in public art for many years. And I think that there was a lot of antipathy towards public art on the part of the art world that dismissed public art and monuments in particular as pedantic, propagandistic, sometimes authoritarian. And there was, I think, for a long time, a general indifference from the general public about monuments. There's this famous statement by Robert Musil that says, he says, "There is nothing so invisible as a monument." And I think for many years, many people in New York were walking by monuments thinking of that. Not everyone. There have been, ongoing discussions and challenges of monuments throughout the city for decades. But I noticed a real turning point in 2017. There was definitely a renewed interest in both the art world and the general public about monuments. The removal of the Robert E. Lee Monument in New Orleans in 2017. And then that same year in August, again, surrounding the figure of Robert E. Lee and removal of Confederate monuments. The monument was a center of the Unite the Right rally, which was essentially not just about taking away monuments, but a demonstration of white supremacy and the rise of, re-rise of neo-Nazism in the country at large. But it was the Robert E. Lee Monument was kind of this focal point. It was a place that people gathered around, and a demonstration that ended in violence and tragically someone's death. So that really brought home this change that suddenly people were looking at monuments and representations in public space with new eyes, refreshed eyes, and really demonstrated how meaningful public representations were and are, especially in a moment when we're symbolically fighting over what the American national story is. Throughout, later in, I think, 2018, 19, New York City mayor created a commission to review monuments in the cities. And there was a lot of debate that was really also exciting, ordinary people analyzing hierarchical compositions, the gestures of figures in monuments, showing a real astute visual literacy. And it was just an exciting moment to start thinking about that. So I would say, just for those of you who know, these three artists are in part one of the exhibition. And the kind of prompt or call that I put out to them was to create new monuments for the future, essentially. Because of how we work at Socrates, these would be temporary in nature. Everything we do is temporary. So that allows for a little more autonomy and experimentation than most monuments throughout the United States are allowed. Um, but it was really key also in this project to give the artist the freedom to decide who and what they wanted to honor. So it was very open-ended. It wasn't predetermined, asking anyone, you know, please create a monument and sort of design a monument to honor this specific person. And I think the role of the artist is to think about values as well. So those are some kind of key aspects of the prompts. And, you know, just to say briefly, I chose these three artists because of their speculative lens. I think they're all very future looking artists who work in a very open-ended manner, which I think is important for re-examining monuments at this time. So I'd love to, now turn to the artists and have them discuss the projects in the order that most of the public encounters them in the park. So that would be beginning with Paul Ramírez Jonas, because his artwork is located closest to the main entrance of the park. And I hope Paul could just talk a bit about creating this monument, who and what he decided to honor, and why.
Thanks everyone for being here in this space, and for the Brooklyn Rail for inviting me, and my two fellow artists for having created such amazing work. For years now, I've been trying to reimagine what a monument can be, and either they're invented, but I rarely invent something. Mostly I just observe the world and replicate things that I find interesting, right? So I always think of Bertolt Brecht, that says that the artists, all they have to do is show living people the world they live in, but to show it in a way that it seems possible of transformation. So I often think of just showing something back, but as a set of moving parts. So I'm really interested in how people can participate with a monument. So what I see mostly is how people already participate with a monument. So historically, and now in the present, Jess has shown us how people can participate with a monument. You can paint it a different color. You can throw it into the bottom of a river. We ourselves as a nation do this all the time. When we invaded Iraq, there was this amazing sort of semi-symbolic moment where we destroyed a statue of Saddam Hussein, right? That is interacting with a monument. But all these interactions with monuments usually require a kind of violence on our part. And because the monument has already inscribed the public space or with permanent materials, there is no room for us. So what I often think is how to make monuments or situations that are somewhat empty, so there can be a space for people to apply or reflect or inscribe their own voices into the space. And that requires a shift of materials or a shift in representation. But the important thing is that this can happen without violence, and also that it's inviting, right? So it's like, you know that you do have the permission to do this. Because otherwise, I mean, I could imagine a world where like we're allowed to always go to the Confederate symbol, and every time a brown or black body is destroyed by the police or someone is killed, we can paint it a different color, and then the accumulation of paint in the monument changes its meaning. And sure, we could do that, but that requires that as citizens, we partake in this kind of violence. Perhaps we're even perpetuating the violence that the police is perpetuating on the body politic, on the citizens. So I'm trying to make these situations that are, I don't want to say nice, but it does scare me sometimes, because sometimes I think they are quite benevolent in a way, right? They're not inciting conflict per se. they're actually quite good-natured. But I also think we're all working communally, and each one of us as an artist is articulating a different part of this discourse. And I think that this is the section that I'm trying to articulate. It's like, how can other people, and I don't know who they're going to be sometimes, enter a monument, make themselves present in the monument, see themselves in the monument. So Eternal Flame just takes a kind of classic form, semi-obelisk, and I just hollow out the base, and then I punch 5 holes into it. Each one has a Parks Department approved grill. We also changed the nature of the park. It's always very important for me to work with bureaucracies. So usually art viewers cannot play with fire. So how do you make an art viewer play with fire? Well, you say they're barbecuing, and how do you make barbecue happen in a park? You need to designate a part of the park as a barbecue zone. So this is a designated barbecue zone approved by the Parks Department with rules and regulations that then permit the public to make a fire. Then these 5 holes punch into the base, each one with a grill, empty out, the smoke can empty out through the top of the monument. And this is just a way to reimagine what an eternal flame is. Instead of having the effort of the state to make this flame never go out, and for this flame to symbolize something usually having to do with war or very abstract, we reimagine as all of us are keeper of that flame. And every time we maintain a family or national or cultural tradition by recreating a dish and we light that fire, that is happening somewhere at this moment in this city and in this country. So we could imagine that the eternal flame is eternal and is always on. So that is sort of the suggestion I'm trying to make with this monument. And it has 5 picnic tables. All right, that's it for my time. Thank you. Oh.
I think Xaviera is next. Can we click through to her images? Xaviera, would you like to speak about your project and what you wanted to honor? I don't see you.
It's okay, Jess, it's all right. She's right there.
I'm here.
Sorry.
Well, it's nice to be here again. We all love our Brooklyn Rail family. And Paul, it's really nice to know. I didn't know some of the things that you were speaking about. Like that's so deep, like about the fire. I'm like so excited because I want to make fire. I love fires. Fires. Wow, I'm gonna take a deep breath because it's thinking about monuments for me is really thinking about, I'm situated in American history, and I really, part of my own life has been to walk in meditation on the American landscape. And, so I've done that and spent time looking at different sites where, the American empire has disrespected people, I want to say. And so for me, I'm always trying to unravel and uncover what it is about this place, like where I am, and then what could be. And, what could be, there are many promises that the United States has like said or given that they've not upheld, or we have not upheld. So for me, with these monuments, these 3 works, I really was looking to historical promises through Special Orders 15, which is colloquially known as 40 Acres and a Mule, and also looking to language of a future, which is the idea of reparations for the descendants of Black America, the descendants of enslaved peoples in the United States. So, this monument for me, these 3 works really feel like kind of a call. They also feel like it's all text-based. So they're all kind of very direct and very kind of heavy-hitting and straightforward. And at the same time, I was also really interested in thinking about the materials that I was working with, the wood, the text, the metal, the plaster. So how to both make something that hits to the historical moment, also hits to promises that weren't kept or could have been kept, and also looking towards the future. For me, understanding the American narrative as it relates to the European engagement on this land and the European desire for conquest and empire. To be a descendant of slavery here is to be a mixed quote unquote race person who basically has all these like psychologies inside of itself. But the main thing is in order for the United States to exist, it had to have people work the land for centuries. And, first it had to take land, and then it had to destroy communities, and then it had to have people work the land. And I really am interested in understanding what would have happened had, after you did all of that, you actually tried to make repair. And, with Special Orders 15, that was a real military decree. And there's complications with trying to own and claim land, but that was a military decree after emancipation that provided 40 acres and a mule to the 4 million descendants of chattel slavery that were considered free at that time. And the land was given, and then the land was taken away very quickly after Lincoln was assassinated. And I think that it's something that we know sort of in popular culture because of Spike Lee's 40 Acres and a Mule productions and all of that. But I really wanted to get into the texts and like the foundational kind of like realness that was, and what that could have been. When you talk about speculative and you talk about this landscape, what would that have looked like even if we had my ancestors had received those 40 acres instead of being taken away, and basically after enslavement left penniless. And to this day, you see the ramifications of that on the streets throughout the country. So for me, it's really looking at that, that history and landscape, and then thinking obviously about repair and reparations and what that would look like. And the fact that whether or not you've been a descendant of enslavers, or you family immigrated here for centuries, or they've been here for 5 years, everyone in the country basically owes a debt to the history of enslavement in this country. And how do we reckon with that? How do we start to give language to that? And so for me, in my dream, these sculptures would, and it's also about thinking about sculpture, but that's another part of the conversation. In my dream, like, we would all kind of reckon with, contemplate. We could contemplate fire. We can contemplate, and then we can contemplate and think about what it means to embody the language of repair in the United States, and how that feels and how it lands. And so that's why the text is very overwhelming, and it's very large scale, because it is an overwhelming project, but it is one that I think we have the capability to do in order to make repair and make amends in the United States. That's the basics.
Thank you so much. I think our next, I think we will go to Jeffrey next, if that's all right. Jess, do you want to jump in and?
Yeah, I think Jeff would be next. So when you come into the park, first it's Paul, then you walk among the 3 structures of Xavieria's piece and sort of experience them one after another, maybe go back and forth between them. And then as you enter further into the park, you reach Jeffrey's work with the Manhattan skyline in the background. So Jeff, would you like to?
Yeah, okay, great. You can hear me, right? Everybody can hear me. Okay. Thank you so much for everyone being here, and thank you to the other artists and to Jess. Yeah, I'm just gonna, I guess the project has grown so much since Jess first invited me. It was a really clear vision in the beginning, and then, you know, the programming is really, I think, what has activated and given meaning to the structure. The original structure is something that has been in my mind for years at this point, and I've really honestly never pursued or been offered the opportunity of space outdoors to kind of let my brain go there about this structure. It's based on Mississippian culture mounds, which is something that I learned about in my 20s. And Mississippian culture is something that my tribe, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, would have emerged from. So it was something that was interesting to me because it's a pre-contact civilization, pre-Columbian civilization, and it was robust and active and a fully realized civilization. And I remember in my 20s when I realized that, or when I learned about it, it was like going from being kind of like invisible to suddenly having presence in history. But then also it wasn't a history that the majority of Americans knew about. So, you know, my work generally, I kind of sample from the experience of my own life, having grown up, living abroad, being Choctaw and Cherokee, but having lived in Germany and Korea and London, and being married to somebody from Norway. And, you know, it's a kind of mashup that I didn't plan. It's just sort of how my life unfolded. So I try to find ways when I do projects to bring all of that in. The title of this piece, because once you enter my house, it becomes our house, is appropriated from a track, Can You Feel It, by Mr. Fingers from 1986. Chicago House at that period in the late 80s and the early 90s, I feel like gave me a space to exist as a brown gay person. You know, I was kind of in my late teens and early 20s at the time. And, you know, I didn't realize at the time that that community embraced me as a young gay man. I didn't realize that those lyrics at the time were about community building, also in a time period where there was so much strife and division going on, and in particular in the LGBTQ plus community due to AIDS and HIV. And so my kind of attraction to those lyrics is about how much they spoke to me as an individual, struggling, but also they were really written, I think, within a community that was dealing with its own kind of grief and mourning of the time. And this kind of envisioning of a more inclusive and peaceful space. So the text on the land, you know, I work with text a lot. So on one side, respect Indigenous land. And these are texts that I have used in other pieces. So I just was kind of sampling again from other works. The other pieces are In Numbers Too Big to Ignore, which I have used previously to speak to the missing and murdered Indigenous women, women's movement, and also The Future is Present, which is a phrase I've used, and then Powerful Because We're Different. And so the pattern, you know, so to go back to Mississippian culture, you know, these mounds are really evidence of a kind of civil structure because of what happened in these mounds. They weren't only for burial, they were for community engagement, they were for government, they were for, you know, even things like plumbing and irrigation. They provide so much evidence that is provocative in the face of the narrative that there were no fully realized civilizations upon contact, when in fact, the Mississippian culture is evidence that counters that. And so that's where the structure comes from. I also love that, I mean, our structure in the park is 44 feet square. That's the footprint. But in reality, these structures go up to 200, I believe 270 feet square. So it's another one of those kind of global structures, one that puts us in the global world in terms of pre-Columbian history on this continent, but also, you know, it's kind of mind-blowing, like how was this built? How was this possibly built? And then the earthworks that exist in these regions are, you know, the serpent mounds being the ones that I was looking at most during this time. But, you know, they're really, again, that kind of awe-struck quality of like, you can only see them from like a super high aerial perspective. And so the graphic posters that are on here were things that I wanted to be able to work with color. I wanted to be able to work with pattern. We knew we wanted to be able to alter things. And I wanted something that could borrow from this language, definitely have my take on it, and could kind of envision a kind of future that melded all of this together. And so far the activations have been by Laura Ortman, by Emily Johnson, and Raven Chacon is our upcoming performer, hopefully for a closing performance. And we did a land acknowledgement that was led by the Indigenous Kinship Collective. And so, yeah, I mean, I could talk more about them, but I just want to say that like they are three people, well, actually 3 people and a group who I know that I have wanted to work with, and we've worked together before, and I hope that we continue working together into the future to try to draw out these more kind of alternative narratives within Indigenous communities and making and thinking. But I will stop there. Thank you. I mean, that's amazing. These are all the things also that I just didn't expect. There was no way for me to envision this until it happened. And then I'm like, wow.
This image in particular is just absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
Like I didn't know what to make of it when I was compiling the slide. It looks like the invention of a new America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say, like, this is exactly the way that I see Laura. She's one person who occupies the space of like thousands.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I like that as a segue, this idea of the invention of a new America. It does have that look of kind of like the Hudson River School painters with the sunlight in the background. And, you know, as some people have talked about, it's very much about landscape, which is tied into our ideas of monuments, land in general. So, I mean, it's really exciting to have all 3 of you artists together since it's been such a kind of crazy year. And it's been hard to find time to reflect. So my first sort of question to you all is about time and history related to this project. You know, the monument inherently has history packed into it. You know, monument comes from Latin monare, to remind or war. So there's an implication of a monument using the past to speak to the public about the future, somehow shape it. But then of course, you have the past, you have the future, as we've talked about. But I kind of wanted to talk about the now time, being, you know, time has passed since the original proposals occurred in 2019, but 2020 has been quite a year. It's one of those years where you're like really conscious of living through history. And so I wanted to ask you, all 3 artists, how you feel that that time and the changes that have happened in the monument landscape, in the political landscape, in narratives that we tell ourselves about what America is, which is indeed one of the roles of a monument, to tell the story of national history, how those recent events have changed either a little bit of the evolution of how you think of the work, or perhaps the reception of the work, how people you think might read it differently than they had, you know, if 2020 hadn't occurred as it did. Does anyone want to take that?
I'll take it. You know, I think sitting, for me, the country, what it needs and what it needs is just exacerbated by this moment. So for me, it feels, you know, the request is still the same, you know, like in terms of the works that I produced, like the request is still the same, and it's even in triple time form, like the requests for reparations in my monuments, and also the request for pause, which, so my monuments have, there's one layer that's a pause, the request for repair for communities, for definitely the descendants of slavery and other communities, are the same, if not more, because what we're seeing on the streets, but what I've been seeing for many years, if you go to San Francisco, if you go to Chicago, if you go to Alabama, if you go to Mississippi, if you go to upstate New York, if you go anywhere in this country, what you're gonna see is a center that holds, you know, a city center, and then you're gonna see a suburb, and you're gonna see lots of layers of poverty and disenfranchisement inside of these communities. Definitely, when you have a white majority, that's 70% of the population, and then you have, you know, in terms of Black Americans, you know, 13% of the population, and you see that they are so our group is so disenfranchised, where you see like the disenfranchisement literally on the streets. So for me, the request is the same. You know, you have to make repair, and you have to address the fact that it's expensive to be an American, and the only way to live an American life is to have the necessary resources for healthcare, education, all the things that were important like 5 years ago, 15 years ago. They somehow still seem to be the same things that are still important, if not more exacerbated. And lastly, I will say, you know, I think I'm so thankful that people took to the streets, and I hope that people continue to take to the streets. And I think that the monuments that we produce should be in like every park, along with many other monuments, should be in many different sites in the United States. And we are just one faction of an impulse. But we need to have like this kind of community engagement, and also awareness of the lands that we are walking upon and around, and the peoples that were here for so long. And then also, obviously, you have to understand that in San Francisco, there are 200,000 homeless Black people primarily, you know what I mean? Homeless people living in a tents on the streets. Like, you have to reconcile with that. We have to kind of start to like reconcile with what we're seeing. And I feel like, you know, with both Jeffrey's work and Paul's work, and hopefully my work, there's an idea of reconciling what you're seeing on the streets now and what is needed in order for us to like move past thinking, book clubbing, and reconciling, and into actually active participation in the country that we live in.
Thank you.
I mean, I like how, Xaviera, you're putting it in this time frame that's not just the now, is that it, and I want to do the same, is that in some ways, again, I don't invent anything. I see examples in the past in which participation in the social sphere was healthier, let's call it. And I see examples as far as Courbet, you know, leading a group of people to overthrow the Vendôme column to Napoleon and empire. And that was an act by an artist, you know, and then I think, is my work just a rehearsal for what, that we could have this kind of participation in public space again? And then in 2020, I feel like, well, I'm out of business, because what the monuments propose, this kind of active participation, is now happening. I'm done. But I'm not done, because unfortunately, one of our most amazing qualities as Americans is the ability for amnesia. We're like a country that is in a constant state of amnesia. And I don't want to be a downer, but I am so almost certain that the work that Jeffrey and Xaviera and I do will still be needed next year. I mean, I just think about going to Occupy Wall Street a few years ago, and that moment seemed like just at the cusp of something, and then the wave broke, and now we're at another cusp. And I think we gotta stay vigilant and stay doing, this work is just not gonna be done. I know it's been an exciting year, but the kind of downer side of me feels like, and there will be we'll need many more years like this before anything budges.
Yeah. Jeffrey, do you have thoughts on that? On the recent history of now?
I mean, the thoughts that come up to me are just, that how much I feel like I have realized like changes for myself during this time, like things that I thought I was very aware and I thought that I had good practices. And I think one of the things that's come up is just how much people endure, and setting new boundaries for what we're not willing to put up with any longer, and being really clear both with ourselves and with people who we work with about establishing those boundaries. And, also I think as an Indigenous person, feeling comfortable with just that, like how uncomfortable I am with the American empire. I think that, and part of that endurance is that this kind of complexity of layering of everything under what is defined as American, when Native people in some ways didn't have a choice, and so it's sort of like, this is our situation, that we were not a part of manufacturing, and where do we go from here? I think with the people who I've invited to take part in terms of activating this monument, there's a kind of humility in me saying, this is what I can do. And we've talked about it. I talk about it as a structure. I talk about it as a platform, kind of conceptually, but really what we made was a stage, and we talked about it in that way. Like, this is literally a stage to highlight content, and that I personally can't be responsible for all that content because it's not mine, And I think that that's what the monument needs to be. It needs to be continuously evolving, and it needs to continually have new content, and it needs to, when we talked about it as a kind of speaker's corner, it needs to be kind of a safe space for people to come and say whatever it is that needs to be said. And some of the things we talked about, Jess and I, between programming, I said, I don't know if an audience is going to show up to hear about Mississippian culture, but in many ways, that's the perfect performance, that nobody shows up and we have somebody speaking about history. That is necessary for us to understand the situation that we're in. So, yeah, I'm just going to say I just had a lot of kind of wake-up calls that I think I agree with both Paul and Zafiria. It's like, for me, this is the way that we have to work. Equity, if nothing else, is a ton of labor. It is a ton of work, and people just need to get on board with that. It's labor and it's not comfortable.
Can I just add one thing to what Jeffrey was saying, which is that time is something that the American empire has, like this strange idea of time. But when you, especially as artists, but as thinkers, when you start to really work with time, like I recognize that we actually have shifted. Like we've already, we are living in a totally different time than we were 7 months ago. And I think like we have to recognize that. And also, I'm not a hope peddler. Like I don't actually use that word because that doesn't feel right for me. But the word that I want to use is that there's an engine underneath us that's moving, and like there's 120 people on this call. And if a lot of the people on this call would understand that we have shifted the time and now we can move things forward. But it takes, as Jeffrey said, labor to move move it forward. And the labor is a multi-layered. It's a moral, and I know it's a complicated word, spiritual, mental, physical thing, as well as like the time that we're living in. There's a few things happening simultaneously that I think we all can jump on and activate this new way of being into a future that we want to see.
I'd love to jump in just for a moment and introduce our poet laureate of lunchtime also wants to jump in with a few thoughts. So Mr. Poetic, it's all yours. All right, one moment. Here we go.
Can everyone hear me? Good, okay. At first, I'm gonna hopefully begin to use this title of Lunchtime Poet Laureate because that's exciting, and I've never had that. Thank you for that. Yeah, so my name is Jive Poetic. First, thank you for letting me share this space. I've never really had an opportunity to have a discussion with people who create monuments before, so this is very interesting and exciting for me because I have a very complicated relationship with monuments because a lot of the monuments in the country where I live here in the United States replicate very violent past that is perpetuated through contemporary times. And it's much like I was hearing earlier, right? It's about the violence that some monuments represent and then how interacting with them might be even a form of violence, right? And so it's very tough because I think, as I heard earlier, monuments exist in this finalized permanent state, right? And they're fixtures. And so I wonder sometimes if that leaves room for context change and community reanalysis and what happens in the future when people decide that the monuments are painful to them. How do we interact with them? And are they violent? I heard it was mentioned earlier as a case of perpetuating the violence, but is it a violence or a self-defense when it's put on indigenous land and it replicates enslavers? I live in a neighborhood where I believe street signs are monuments, right? I live in a neighborhood where the street signs are all named after slavers and enslavers. And I'm like, to interact with these things is not to put the artist out of the business, but to make sure everyone knows, listen, this is a violence and I'm living through it and I'm being forced to see it every day. And sometimes we have to recognize like are we hurting people for the sake of producing our art? And if that was our intention, then we have to be responsible. And it is part of that amnesia that we exist. Like, listen, did we forget that this person enslaved everybody? So when we redesign monuments, right, we make them in replication of monuments and then we draw people in with new ways to interact with them. I wonder if the graffitiing up the monuments is an act of violence or an act of self-defense. Right, the people were here. Then you put a monument on top of them, and then they graffitied it. Right. So which one was the violence, and which one was the perpetuation of it? It's very complicated. I mean, that's why I feel lucky to have this conversation with you all. But I do find myself walking around spaces where monuments remind me of my ancestors being enslaved, and then how do I get them out of here? And then do I consider the artist's feelings when I want to get them out of here?
So, Mr. Poetic.
Thank you for Mr.
Lunchtime laureate. No, this thing you say about that they're fixtures. One thing that have slowly had to articulate coming from this show, and specifically because of that, it's Xaviera and Jeffrey are also that the three of us have made monuments, and I wasn't thinking about this so clearly before the show, which is that colonialism displaced people all over the world. You know, first genocide of native peoples. Then the North Atlantic slave trade moving and traumatizing another set of people, but also something we rarely think about in this country, indentured servitude that also moved people from one place to another. And then in the aftermath that all the colonized lands are left so unable of supporting their societies, then migration, right? And that these stories of these four groups of people are the kinds of stories that are not told in monuments, you know, and then how do you tell the story of basically the majority of the world that was affected in this way? And I guess in Audre Lorde's words, right, like, can the master's tools, will they ever dismantle the master's house, right? Like, so is the response to tell these stories, and this is a conversation I had with Xaviera in a previous panel like a year ago, which is like, so can we use permanence now? Like, is it appropriate to use permanence? Is it appropriate to create new fixtures, as you said, to tell the stories that have not been told or shoved aside? And that's something that I'm thinking about and trying to digest. Yeah.
Well, context changes, right? It's just as societies change, right? It's like, for example, it's like the nonprofit sector, right? The idea is to write yourself out of a job, right? You know, if you don't address it, you can't get rid of the problem, then the job exists forever, and you have to reevaluate how to approach it, right? And the thing is with the monuments, even, okay, let's for a second say with poetry, right? Because I'm a poet, right? At some point, maybe my poetry becomes irrelevant, silly, ridiculous, and people think it's a joke because the problems that I'm addressing no longer exist. Becomes, maybe it's not even valuable to people anymore, and that's painful, but okay, right? Because maybe I wrote something that addressed the problem that people have gotten past, you know, and maybe someone digs it up and then they value it. But ultimately, I have to know that at some point, this whole thing that we are involved in may shift, and the context of my work will shift with it, you know. And then maybe people say we don't need this anymore. This is just not. We don't find the same value in it, you know. And maybe some people do, and they preserve it. But once I share the work with the public, it's no longer just mine, and it's a conversation now. It's a multi-log. Many people are discussing it, and it's the same thing if I do a poem and somebody walks out of the room, they're rejecting it. Is that a violence, or did I affect them in a way in which they weren't prepared to handle? How did they react to it? But it may happen. You know, that too is the risk of being an artist. Offending people, hurting people unintentionally, intent versus impact, right? I didn't intend to hurt people, but I did. And what does that mean for the work? And should this work be in this room?
I'd love to jump in. I'm not technically on this panel, but it's Friday, so let's go.
Yeah.
I'd like to jump in for just a moment, Jess, if that's all right. I'm really intrigued by a lot of things that Jive Poetic is saying, and then also Paul, I like a lot of what you were saying, and I really appreciate that you rope in the history of indenture, the history of chattel slavery, and like, you know, indigeneity in this country. This reminds me of something that like Zafiria, you said to us when you were on the New Social Environment months ago in the pre-check. You said this thing that we have to start with a trifecta of acknowledgements, that it's not these isolated wounds or traumas, that it's a triangle of Indigenous and First Nation land acknowledgement. It's you know, colonial enterprises, the colonial empire that still persists, and then it is also chattel slavery. And I really appreciate that. Like for me, I always have this moment where I always wonder, like, do we have to think in terms of scarcity, right? Like when I look at a lot of monuments in my life, not in my life, but you know, on the streets, right? There are a lot of monuments that are funded. And when I say monument, I really appreciate what you said, like street signs are monuments too, if they're named after slavers. You know, an institution, Yale, Columbia, the Met, right, are funded by legacies that are both chattel slavery and indenture, right? They connect all of us, right? So and I think there's a way that this country sort of pits us, you know, or can pit us, you know, into this kind of like politicking about like, oh, this is about this issue, this is about that issue. But I will say for me, you know, I'm not like directly, you know, like for instance, I included the Columbus statue in Chicago in the beginning of our slides because, you know, Jive, like what you were saying about the graffiti on the statue, right? And is that a violence is something that was really a huge thing for me in the last months, that the thing that really activated the monument in Chicago, the last Columbus monument in Chicago that was like deeply contested and became a site of protest, the thing that enlivened it is the protest. Right. And I think that comes back to the thing Jess was saying, that like the right wing, you know, mobilizes around Confederate monuments on purpose. Right. But the forces of like progressivism and the forces of leftism and like, you know, all of us, we're mobilizing for something as well. And I'm noticing that like the protests that come out also come out around monuments as well. Right. So I guess first of all, I love where this conversation is going. And secondly, I have been wanting to ask each of you, how do we feel about like the activation of the monument? Like, is the Columbus Monument worth it if, you know, if it becomes occupied, right? Or if it's, you know, if people like congregate around it and like paint it up, right? Is that worth it, or should we be taking it down? Like, how do we talk about social spaces of monuments? Like, what is that doing?
I think that it goes in different waves. Ultimately, these conversations are about resources. And for me, these conversations, we can do book clubbing and anti-racism workshopping and land acknowledgements and all of the things. We need to do them all. We can do them all. But ultimately, we're talking about the conditions of people's lived experiences and their material well-being. And I think we can't forget that. It always comes back down to that. How do you focus the conversation on people's living experiences and their material well-being in this country with abundant resources that can provide for everyone, and we could all be living a really proper, clear American life. And you know, these monuments, these conversations, they should always shift, right? But I would hope, this is my monument to a conversation. I would hope that at the end of the day, we continue to try to understand how these conversations are unpacking how we can better the material lived conditions of people here in the United States, and then how we act and support this empire that we don't even agree with. You know what I mean? Like there's no way for us to like say, I don't want to put this much money in war. I want to put it in something else. So it's how do we take care of this ecology here, the history of it, and also its present conditions? And then how do we start to shape what this empire does moving forward? And I think for me, it could be a monument, it could be a feather. It doesn't matter. It's really about how we lift up. I grew up Buddhist, and I think something that the Buddhist community always talks about is like life conditions, you know, and I always am thinking of that. Like, how can we lift up everyone's life condition? Because that's beyond all of this, is what we're really talking about. And so I'm just going to end to say, I hope that we stop talking about all this stuff and actually also get back. We can talk about it and make things, but then we get back into an active participation of citizenry. And I think that is really where I want to see any conversation around monuments or any of it goes.
Yeah, I agree. I think the act of creating art to create action is very important, right? And I guess in 2015, 2016, when activity around the Theodore Roosevelt statue at the museum in the city, when people started making actions and gestures around, I started to understand monuments in a much different way. I started understanding them as catalysts for different kinds of performance art and performance behavior that actually was resistance behavior, right? Like, this monument brings people out, but then what are they doing and what are they saying in reaction to it, right? And I think that too becomes part of the statement, right? You know, you have this monument, and we're thinking about removing it, but what are the people saying? And then what are they doing after they leave, right? It creates this conversation, which creates this action. And I think that's very important. So when you put a statue of Columbus somewhere and then people say, let's graffiti this up, let's get this out of here, then the conversation is, look, this is what we need to address, right? These people have this reaction to this thing. What's creating the conditions for them to even feel this way? And what are they being reminded of? And how do we address that?
Yeah. I mean, I think going back to what Xaviera said about resources too, and, you know, sort of repair and reparations needs to happen on definitely a federal level, you know, addressing these two debts, you know, that we have as a nation: stolen land from Indigenous people, and our economy being built on a slave economy. But within the art fields, like, if it's about redistribution of resources, I do think, I mean, my question is, can new monuments be a form of reparations? And I mean, in the sense that within the art world, that's the sphere that we have power in, is giving a platform and giving money and resources to artists to make statements, to, promote their values. Obviously that, is not enough. The problem is much more beyond our sphere. But creating these new monuments, I would hope makes some sort of repair.
I mean, in some way we have really unreasonable expectations from artists. We're like, we're going to give you this relatively small amount of money. Please make me something that heals the country. And you're like,
no.
Wait, for this year? Because I'm a little busy. I could have it ready by next year. It's like,
I don't mean,
no, I don't mean that, but that's how you
burden on, because it's all our problem. But within the sphere, I think monuments can do something.
No, I do think they can do something, because all change is cultural change. What is stopping us from a lot of this changes is a mindset, right? Money alone is not going to fix it. The culture has to change. And, artists are, for better or for worse, specialists and producers of culture. So there is value in artists participating as cultural producers, not just activists, or citizens. And we should be activists and we should be citizens, but we are also producers of culture. And what we need is a cultural shift to see the past differently, to imagine the future differently. And that we can do, not alone, but communally. We're like coral reef, right? It's like each one of us is doing a little bit, and eventually we'll have the Great Barrier Reef.
Because honestly, just as Paul said, I mean, advertising, all of it is looking at what the artist does. We are literally like the bottom feeders. I love us to pieces, but like we are the raw material. And then culture, so what you guys put on the wall, what you decide to put on the, everywhere, and then what we decide to make is all the material for what, for instance, Gucci is gonna be like pilfering off in a few years. So, or whoever, you know what I mean? It doesn't even matter, whoever is not making the artwork. So yeah, it's of vital importance. And that's why it's important to look at the whole structure of organizations and institutions that present art and try to think of new ways of them also supporting a more reparative structure by having First Nations, Indigenous voices, all kinds of people who are not culturally white in this country.
I just wanted to say, I think, I don't know, it's kind of a lesson I feel like that informed my own work a while back, was that, your audience or whoever you're speaking to, everybody's entering these conversations at different points, right? We're not all entering with the same kind of background and level of information. And, something that might work at Socrates Sculpture Park, to put it into central Oklahoma or central Mississippi, is going to be very different, I think, I've seen some of the questions in the chat about like can monuments still be effective and things like that. And, because I knew with Socrates, for instance, that these sculptures tend to be temporary, one of the things early on was trying to figure out a way that we could have the ziggurat structure, one, move, like be taken apart, stored and moved, and also that it could be readdressed according to another context. And so we actually are doing that. We'll be moving it, and we're in the process of figuring out programming based on kind of our experience at Socrates Sculpture Park. But the other thing is, it's not just the experience of like the materials and how things functioned and, a time of COVID, but it's also, as these conversations move along, thinking about, for me, this has forced me to look deeper at like, what do I mean when I'm saying like Indigenous and queer? Because I don't feel like we hit the mark that I was hoping to hit. And a lot of the reason why we didn't hit that mark had to do with being in a pandemic, had to do with finances, had to do with time, had to do with being able to have gatherings and people in one space, and the inability to plan, right? And so looking forward, trying to just sort of, you have to be very present, I think, to effectively readjust the way you're moving through space, right? And if we don't have the kind of wherewithal to be very present, which I think a lot of artists, the longer we do what we do, you realize how important that is, that we can't just make decisions on the fly, but you have to carve out a space, physical, mental, psychic, where you can really kind of like slow down and force yourself to be present. Yeah, I think it's a really, and there's something, I don't know if I'm making sense anymore, but I feel like there's a certain point at which I have had to lean into stepping away from my own ego, which when we talk about the artist, the individual of the artist being celebrated, I think works counter to creating a monument, you know, because in many ways it's like, and that's what's been one of the biggest pleasures of this project for me, is that, you know, to be able to just facilitate and in a weird way to kind of meditate on like, what is my best role in this, you know? And every collaborator I've had, I said, I'm happy to, you know, be behind a camera. I'm happy to like dress people. I'm happy to perform. I'm happy to do whatever it is necessary to facilitate experience. So as we think about monuments moving around or being in different contexts, I hope we don't avoid, you know, far right regions of the country. And I hope when we go into those regions that we truly shut down the parts of ourselves necessary to listen and to facilitate effective engagement.
Can I ask a question about that, Jeffrey?
Mm-hmm.
So I asked this of a friend of mine. I have a house in upstate New York, which is basically a far right region. Love it up there, gorgeous. My ticks are crazy, but the ticks as in the little insects. But so above all of that far rightness is the Second Amendment and the glory and love of that amendment. So how far, my question is always, how far can you go in a far right region when ultimately there is the love of that amendment? And not only the love of that amendment, but if we disagree, your impulse may be to use aspects of that amendment protected by the government to make me disappear. So I'm just curious how far we can go in, because that's a question that people always talk about, is like, well, you need to cross the thing, you know, you need to cross the line.
You know, I think the thing that I thought about in your question was some of the responses of artists of color in the 2019 Whitney Biennial, who I think a lot of the art world didn't understand some of the risks that those artists were taking on a personal level in terms of relationships to our communities or highlighting ourselves as targets of statements, right? And I think even in those works, you know, I know, like, what did you respond to? When did you feel comfortable speaking to the press? What did you feel comfortable saying? And I think, you know, for instance, like in Indigenous Kinship Collective, I have such huge respect for them because they cross boundaries that I'm not ready to do yet on a personal level in terms of being the face of some of the statements that they make. Having said that, I think that they were so important to be the voice of the land acknowledgement and to begin their land acknowledgement with addressing everybody there in the most gracious way: you are on stolen land. And it wasn't a comfortable land acknowledgement. It was a statement, a declaration: realize now you are on stolen land. And that land acknowledgement has shifted from land acknowledgement to a land back movement. And my role in terms of questioning, like, who am I in that spectrum? I feel responsible to represent that to anyone who comes to me and says, we're interested in pursuing a land acknowledgement. I'm like, well, once you admit you stole it and it's unceded, the next step is to figure out how to give it back. And so everybody's like, well, what do we do? And I'm like, you know, I'm a big fan of like, make the problem the subject. If we don't know how to do it, then let's turn it into the subject and figure that out. I think it guides us, you know, this whole kind of being able to converse, it guides us towards the next steps if we're willing to kind of be open to it, you know. But to answer your question, I think it really comes down to, you know, what you feel comfortable with. Because, and I think it's also about forming larger networks, because there are people within larger networks that I think cover the scope of what people feel comfortable with, you know. And yeah, so when I, for instance, I've done projects in Mississippi, I mean, I never want to be the front person of my project. I'm like, I need people who live in Mississippi to be the people who speak with me when we introduce anything.
Is now maybe a, oh.
No, go.
No, you go, Paul.
No, the question Xaviera brings is because one of my specialties is to make the thing that anyone can put whatever they want into it. And there's a scary thing about that, because then it's hard, because I have to accept that I will be okay with whatever goes into it, right? So if I have the monument where people make promises, I need to be okay with whatever they promise. If I make the monument where people lie, I have to be okay with whatever negation they make. And I know exactly in what you mean. And right, it's like, well, you show it in New York and you're safe of what kind of statements are going to go, or that if someone is expressing something I personally disagree with, they'll be in the minority. But what if the piece goes somewhere else? And I don't know, I mean, part of the challenge of 2020 is that I like to think that actually everyone is a good person. And these last two elections have really shaken that faith to some degree, and I'm like, well, can I continue to make this work with that assumption, and what does it mean to make work that doesn't assume that of people? So I'll get back to you in a few years on that one, but that's sort of what I'm thinking. Like, if that assumption is not true, what does it mean for the public, for public work, right? Or for the stance that you as an artist should not take a position, and you should just kind of make a platform that is open to what, right? And I think one thing that has been scary for myself, at least, is seeing the right take tools that I used to think belonged to the left or to artists and use them for very different purposes, and to see that those tools inherently didn't have intentions, like they could actually be used for whatever purpose the user wants to use them, right? Even the idea of plurality and relativity, in that each person's history has validity, and what their truth is their truth, right? We can see that how that can be twisted, or used to hold a position that I disagree with.
Well, I will say this has been a beautiful conversation. We have a stunning number of questions that have come in from the audience. But before we turn over to the Q&A session, I was wondering, I know Jess had sort of like asked that maybe if, our special guests have any questions they want to ask one another. So I want to give a moment for that, if you have any sort of pending questions.
Or we could open it up, because I feel like there have been some questions that have gone back and forth.
Paul Ramírez Jonas says, let's open it up. Is that the vote? All right. So our first beautiful question, I found this very interesting. There was a lot of synchronicity in our questions coming in, and usually we make a congregate, but today I'd like to have our first question sort of read by the two people who voiced its two halves. So that our first question will come from Aaron Levy Garvey and Nathaniel Ancheta. And I will turn on your microphones now, but I just let you both ask sort of the two hands of the same question. So maybe, Aaron, could you go first?
My question is, what about the concepts of roving monuments that can exist in spaces around the country in an impermanent manner? In order to create a dialogue and community building in a number of cities simultaneously. Similarly to a tour or an exhibition on view, something like that, does anyone see that as a possible way of moving forward and keeping a constant conversation? Specific things come to mind, like Public Trust and Key to the City by Paul, or She Never Dances Alone by Jeff, or the in situ images that Zafiria has been making since the mid-2000s. all of these I see as almost monuments in general that could then possibly exist in other cities. So does anyone see that as a way that monuments can still exist, but impact broader communities and flow a conversation?
Did you want me to add to that? Or
yes, please. Can you read your question?
Sure. So on top of kind of roving monuments, the question I had was that monuments can be defined as a static object that symbolizes ideologies of the past that does perpetuate into the present and the future. But because the world isn't static, is it possible to think of a monument as a fluid space as opposed to a static object? It was mentioned that monuments have been places for action and evoke action, but usually those actions come out of a mindset of conflict. So my question is, can a monument be a place or space of conversation as opposed to a space of conflict around issues of identity or ideology or sort of other forms of social or economic politics? And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I'm gonna take both those ideas, and that's a new work of mine. So sorry, don't try it, you all. But I something that came to mind as you two were asking those questions was, I mean, I think it's because I'm listening. I don't listen to music a lot, but lately I've been listening because I was a punk rocker and a metalhead when I was younger. So I've been thinking about this structure, and I'm like, oh my God, like imagine if, let's say for instance, and DJ, yeah. And let's say for instance, if some of those, I mean, they're heavy, but like some of these Confederate monuments actually went on tour. Like it was kind of like this kind of like, you know, concert series in a way, whereas like, you know, they just all came, like my monument went here, then your monument went there, but then actually some Confederate monuments from the South came up here, and we like had like, you know, we protested or had conversations, or Monument Palooza. Like, I don't know, there's something in that that's actually quite exciting, which I never would have, that is such a dope idea, it's mine. But that's such a dope idea of like having that, so that everyone, and it goes back to what Jeffrey was saying, you know, like everyone kind of gets to air out their stuff and their grievances and sees, and you can see this community's angry at this, or they support that. And then it's kind of like activates the whole entire public sphere. Because right now we've got these in New York, and yeah, they're gonna travel a little bit, but you know, it would be amazing if this was like just an active conversation and going into communities that we don't agree with politically. Like, how could we like activate all of it?
I mean, monuments that travel articulate different relations of power that are super interesting, right? Because it's like, who gets to make a monument that doesn't travel? The person who can claim a space as theirs forever. So who can get to make a monument in Washington, DC? But if you're from a community that every time you have to move in the city because your neighborhood keeps getting gentrified, maybe a monument that travel reflects your condition, because that monument also doesn't have a place to stay forever. But there's also the issue of like, the French went into Egypt and took monuments and took them to Paris, and the English went to Iraq and took giant monuments, unthinkable that they could be moved, right? And brought to London. So there's also that exercise of power in moving a monument. Like, who has the power to move such a heavy object? So I don't know where I'm going with this, but like Xaviera, like, yeah, there's like a piece there. Make a monument that's really heavy and see who can move it. I don't know, right? But that, I think that we could double down on the complexity of that. It's like movement can mean weakness, and movement can mean strength. Movement can mean that you're in the periphery, and movement can mean that you're in the center. And that would be a really interesting thing to play with as another way to articulate these ideas.
Yeah. Well, I know I was going to say we did talk about that before, Zafiria. I think I asked you what your, it was an outside question, what your ideal location for this monument would be, because knowing it's temporary, like what would the ideal location be? And I remember you said, which I love, that this monument needed to be in every state. And this idea of traveling the monument and the message, I think is really important and an exciting way to think about monuments and their lives through time.
And one thing that just came to mind, that the horribleness of the monument that absolutely can never move, right? The most atrocious thing about Mount Rushmore is that it can never be moved. Even the most permanent monument, we're like, well, I could see a future where we could just put it in storage, right? But Mount Rushmore is such a violence because it is now the landscape. So yeah, there's that.
Yeah, but the whole, okay, this is, the United States is a monument, like America, I'm not talking about indigenous land. I'm talking about the empire of the United States, and America is a monument to whatever you want to say, white supremacy, empire building of such a thing. It's you know what I mean? We literally have to change the monument. I'm not trying to be hippie esoteric, but I am saying there's the physical monuments that we have, the literal monuments, and then there's like, how do we change the monumental ideology of this empire? And like, how do we shift that? That's the ultimate monument that the whole world that's interested in this place is looking for, that is interested in us shifting. How are we going to monumentally change this monument that is bent on destruction?
I think that's a perfect place to transition, because I wish I could ask the follow-up question, give me the steps. But I also want to ask, and this is sort of looking specifically at Jeffrey's work, but I really like a lot of the themes that have come up, sort of thinking of the monument as temporary, but perhaps, because it is temporary, because it is movable, a zone of autonomy, and thinking of it as like social sculpture. So my question is, like, Jeffrey, you said earlier you didn't really hit the mark because of COVID, but if you had hit that mark, I'm wondering how it would have looked and felt, your sculpture, and whether you could tell us a little bit more about that final image, the final performance, fill us in, who's Laura and how is that exactly how you imagine her? Yeah.
Well, I'll keep it really brief just for time, but some of the other programs that we didn't get to was, there's a couple of LGBTQ plus gospel choirs and reverends in the New York City area, and that structure can hold some crazy amount of weight. So we could have like 50 people singing gospel, and we could have somebody giving sermons off of the top. That was one vision. The other one was a fully academic kind of lecture series with projections on the monument about everything from graphic design that has emerged out of activism to historic kind of histories about indigeneity in this land, including Mississippian culture. We also talked about programming the interior, which was storytelling and intimate experiences for people. Trying to think what some of the other, we were on the way to working with a very young voguing house that is in Long Island City that due to COVID didn't happen, but the idea of bringing them together with an established house in Manhattan, giving them that experience. We had high school students who were going to work with Raven Chacon to come in and work on a new composition and have him lead it. So we had this long kind of list, a wish list of what was going to happen there. And I think we've done an amazing job. I mean, I think I really appreciate all of the hard work that went in from the team at Socrates. But that's what makes me really thrilled with the idea of a future for it. Laura and Emily were both really possible because they live in New York City. And so in terms of travel restrictions and things like that, I mean, they were who I wanted regardless. But, Laura is, I think she's just like she's one of a kind. I don't know if I'll ever meet anyone like her who can perform like her. She takes me from like, she makes me really feel grounded in the space that I'm in and pay attention to it. And her music like reverberates on so many different levels, from like physical, spatial, spiritual. And she just takes me on this like journey till I'm like looking at the world like it's the size of a pea, like from the universe. And then she brings me back down in the most gentle way. And Emily, I've never worked with before, but I knew just from her presence that her strength is this incredible fragility that she's not afraid to forefront herself with. When you meet her, she's just like this, you know, bird to me walking around. And to see her perform was amazing. And I think from a Native perspective, I think that they're shifting things and making things happen with the work that they're producing. That performance was an act of everything we're talking about tonight. It was, I'm talking about Emily's performance right now, but it was an act of calling everything from motherhood, fertility, planting, regeneration, renewal, future. If you were there that night, that is what happened. And with Laura, you know, it was a similar thing. It was like an awakening. It was just this kind of like call to charge something. And I think, you know, it's one of the things that I think, I don't know, I shouldn't say, but sometimes I feel as though we've forgotten that we're capable of doing that. And that it's such a self-conscious act in our society to imagine yourself as someone who can command change on lots of levels through something like a painting or a sculpture or voice or sound. But I believe it's totally possible.
Thank you so much. Before we go to our closing remarks with our publisher Fangui and then our poet laureate of the lunchtime, I'd love to take one last question from the chat, and this is from Elizabeth Upenix, who I believe had to leave, but I really liked this question. She asks, how do we create a living and changing monument or space that can adapt to contemporary life and new narratives? And I want to extend that question just a little bit. I'm wondering, from the four of you, how do you think we'll monumentalize or historicize the moment we're living in now? Like, what are the ways that we'll sort of create monuments to like the revolution and upheaval and like liberation or efforts of this year? Yeah.
Hopefully we won't have to monumentalize it because we'll be still in it for a while. I mean, it's taken hundreds of years to do all of this. Hundreds of, you know, we don't have a comprehension of centuries, I think, you know, but centuries are a long, long time, right? And then they're a short time at the same time, depending on your perspective. But I actually hope that this time, I don't want COVID times in terms of sickness and health, but I do want revolutionary times for a really long time, because what has been built here is untenable. It's destructive, and it continues to destroy people's well-beings. Whilst half of us on this call may have comfortable lives that they can live and function in, half of us don't. And that's unacceptable. So I hope that there is no monument to COVID revolution, liberation time. I hope that we kind of like come out of it and we're just like a totally changed people, you know? And it could happen quite quicker than I think we realize. It might not have to be this generation. It could be now. We just have to imagine it so, right? No, I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, I'm a total nerd of monuments, and I always have a terrible suspicion that the minute we commit something like that to permanence is because we have this anxiety that it's about to be forgotten. You know, it's almost like, I don't know if it's like a chicken and egg thing, but it seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like the minute people say we shall never remember, no, sorry, we shall never forget, it's because they feel the fear that they're going to forget, and they're like, oh well, I better commit it to stone, or bronze.
Right.
So yeah, I'm with Xaviera. I hope, like if I see a monument to Black Lives Matter, then I feel like, well, it's over. That sort of would be my instinct, that's what that means.
Right. The idea that the traditional monument kind of freezes and encapsulates memory rather than, and then the memory stuck in there so you can forget it, sort of, making a monument rather than living with the continued history and sort of dispersing memory of that.
I wonder if it's also, and if it's possible that maybe the institutions reimagine the monuments they're willing to support as well. Because maybe, for example, maybe the monument isn't the celebratory statue to the thing, but actually a counter statement to the mission or statement or thing or memory. For example, maybe with Robert E. Lee removal or Roosevelt, maybe the monument becomes the broken statue and then that remains. And then we remember that, okay, they did not like this. And then that's the monument. The breaking of the monument becomes a monument as well, and maybe that changes the statement, but it still becomes a preservation, right? People remember, right? If you see a Black Lives Matter monument now, then it's maybe people forget what it means, right? But maybe the Black Lives Matter monument is a police car flipped over or something like that, or something that creates the conversation and the question of why and how this happened in the first place.
Love that. I'm on board. I feel like, what we're all saying is that we're the monuments, and we'll keep it moving with us. And on that note, this has been such a beautiful conversation. Our last question and remark will come from our very own publisher and captain of this fine vessel, Phong H. Bowie. And Phong, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Thank you, Malvika. Thank you, Xaviera. Thank you, of course, Jeffrey, and for all the question exchanges, and our incredible poet also, and Paul. Thank you. Paul mentioned early on of Audre Lorde, that famous quote, for the master tools will never dismantle the master's house. And it just reminded me something I spent several days of reading before the last editorial. We all read it before, Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. And I'm just reminded now, he once said there are many men of principle in both parties in America, but there is no party of principle. So it's so interesting to go further back how he's so excited being in America, coming from Europe, where he was so taken the fact that this absence of class and the dominance of potential liberal ideas here. But he's also know that this liberal idea being inherently a apolitical position as mean to create a so-called potential impartial structure. But at the same time, he was so wary of the potential of anything that lead to the tyranny of the majority. So it's very interesting, the notion of self-interest well understood. And what you mentioned earlier about also Courbet being the admirer and anarchist of Proudhon, Paul, with the Vendôme column that was in the Paris Commune in 1871. The same to be said earlier with Delacroix leading liberty, leading the people, So we always have this incredible predicament, very mixed feeling towards any kind of propaganda, where the, leading idea of the day, a certain character or people to be portrayed. And I know that every time the artists put their hand on it, we end up regret it super soon after. So it's very complicated with this whole thing right now, but I think we, as you say, Xaviera, I mean, it took this long for us to be more conscious of this necessity. And I feel that the narrative should be reclaimed, but we can't be it as artists. We can't really create. I think it's dangerous to create a political agenda, you know? I think artists should be able to walk and think and create without the need, the handrail, so to speak. You know, we shouldn't have any kind of doctrinaire or any strong idea that can be applied to anything we do. That's why what the show of Socrates is so interesting, because it's not permanent and it addresses different needs, different kind of subtleties, and it demands a great deal upon the viewer to provide the rest of what need to be thought of. So it doesn't quite spell out to everyone that who come there and see the work, you know. So for that, I think that's our job, the ultimate job, the artists or the poets, it to present the beauty and the through subtlety, not to explicit, you know, spoon feeding doctrinaire. And I think that's exactly why the work there is so inspiring. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Jess, for curating this also, Xaviera. And John Hartfield is also who's on the Zoom here too, the director of such an amazing institution. So back to you, Malvika.
Thank you so much, Phong. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think this conversation has been incredible. And without further ado, we're going to keep it going. We've come to our poetry hour. So at the Rail, we had a tradition pre-COVID of closing our lunches with a poem. We'd sit around reading them together. And we've been lucky enough to continue that into our community events, but now we have fabulous professional poets. So I'm so pleased to welcome Jive Poetic to our stage. Jive Poetic is a writer, organizer, educator, also a DJ based in Brooklyn, New York. He's the founder of Insurgent Poets Society, Carnival Slam, Cultural Exchange, and also the co-founder of the Brooklyn Poetry Slam. Currently, he's the Friday Night Poetry Slam curator and host at the New Yorker Poets Cafe, which we're interested in seeing how that's going during the current climate. When he's not on tour, he teaches poetry and hip hop workshops to at-risk youth in New York City and in the surrounding areas. Give it up for our very own poet laureate, Jive Poetic. Take it away.
Lunchtime poet laureate. I'm very excited. Thank you very much. So yeah, I'll do this poem. I won't give too much intro to it because I know probably we're close on time, but it's about the idea of indigeneity, kidnapped people. This is a warning. This is a warning from the bottom of a slave ship to the indigenous people of this hemisphere. Arawak woman. My fear is this warning may never reach from the alarm of my throat to your intuition, for we share no language to express the danger your people face. They are not safe. They will be ripped limbless. Their blood will run to stain you fearful, stain you motionless as the armadas come, soiled in deception, soiled in the stink of self-righteous, they will move, pulpit murder on breath, Vatican permission slipped in sails, will blame religion for malice and brand you savage. At sword point, plant flagpole in womb, scar accent mark on vocal cord, colonized child before birth they will. Find pleasure in conquest, pleasure in possession, pleasure inside you they will take. Against will suspect tea in your tears, curry in your spine, gold in your skin will break flesh to confirm. Not care of your screams, care of mine, care of the villages they will burn, the dances they will condemn, the customs they will smoke out of fear, mistake our models for nothing holy. They carry firearm at fingertips, smuggle us in the hull of their ship. You will not be spared. They want to slave trade you. They want to cotton field you. They want a tobacco plantation you. Keep them in your skepticism. Trust the mumble of your instincts. They predator. You pray behind every jungle trap set, every poison dart you dip blow into their path, every hex you can chant curse, every spear into their chest conjure, whatever deities you need raise, whatever spirit you need run, until fatigue come, cramp, until collapse come, hide, until strength come, pick up your feet, pump your arms until flight come, until broken wing crawl, until broken hip woman, they want to Latina you, they want to Caribbean me, they want to Western us into their second class native sister. We will not let them. We will not be their sugar cane, not be their molasses, not be their rum. We'll machete chop them first. Will we turn ourselves to the sun before we ever let our sons grow into their cattle, before we ever let our daughters dry from foreign suckle. We will resist the cross of their blood, from the cross of their church to the church of their hate. Mistake our modest for nothing holy. Disease and rats will come. Pain and shackle will come. Against culture of cruel, we shall be the Igbo with open warnings, whipped bloody on our backs. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jive Poetic. It's incredible. Thank you so much, all of you. Everyone, get your bubbles together. We're all going to Socrates Sculpture Park. Got to check out these monuments and counter monuments. Thank you so much, Jess. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Zafiria. Thank you, Jeffrey. And thank you for everyone who tuned in today. This has been truly remarkable. Please join us again on Monday when we will be joined by artist Brad Kahlhammer, who will be in conversation with scholar and curator Susan Harris. That will also close with a poetry reading. I really hope you all have a beautiful weekend, and you can now turn on your microphones if you'd like. I don't know whose news that is, but I love it.
Thank you, Jive.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Jive.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Fun.
Thank you so much, guys. That was super inspiring.